I'm suddenly taking an interest in me. I didn't notice you there.
Yeah,
That's
interesting.
why.
I was listening. It's been 5 minutes. I've been listening to you. Interesting.
Okay.
Carry on.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So the Gospels are recording eyewitness accounts of Jesus, his life and his teaching.
Unlike the claim of the Quran,
Yeah.
so unlike the claim of the Quran, where the revelation comes directly to the prophets, in your case, the Bible is collecting this information from hearsay.
Some of it is the record. Some of the Bible is recording what the prophets brought from God's message. You know through the prophets, and some of it is, as you say, the account of eyewitnesses to Jesus' life.
So, based on this, can't you see the argument is that the Quran is more credible because of this mechanism?
I don't think so. No, I don't.
Because
think
of this,
credible.
because if it is coming from a third party or from hearsay, it is certainly less credible compared to a claim, the other claim, where it comes directly from the Creator to the Prophet.
But I would not accept the Quran to come directly from God.
No, you don't have to accept it, but the claim is such thing, right?
Yeah, I would agree. The Quran has a greater claim, as you would say, a greater claim, saying this is the direct speech of God, it's direct speech of Allah.
Why would you not accept it, by the way?
Well, I don't accept it. It doesn't match with the teaching of the scriptures as revealed, okay?
No, I mean,
prophets.
the statement you made that I will not
It's not the
accept.
same as the message of the Bible.
Yeah, I agree.
And therefore,
I agree, but there are many similarities.
there are obviously some things in common.
Yeah.
There are some
So
things in
between the
common,
three
I'll say that.
faiths, the similar
There
thing
are
is
some
that
things in common, obviously.
Yeah.
We agree with that.
between the three
And there are
faiths.
some things which are the same, some things which are different. We could say,
No, but you said have you studied the Quran?
I have read the Quran, yes.
Yes.
Read it all, yeah.
Have you studied
I
about?
wouldn't say I'm not
I agree.
I'm not an imam.
Yeah.
I'm not
Well, neither am I.
studying Islam like that in that sense.
Yes.
I've not studied the Quran in that sense.
What I'm
But
saying
I
is,
have read it. Yes, I have read it.
What I'm saying is that have you studied the history of the preservation of the Quran? Because that's what you were discussing, right? The preservation of the Bible, as you have seen, is not something that is preserved.
Because it claims to be it claims to be the account of eyewitnesses in the case of the Gospels.
None of the witnesses. You don't even have any manuscripts.
Okay, we do have manuscripts.
From the first century, none. From the second century, maybe a small
small
credit card
section.
size fragment.
Right, yeah.
So from first 200 years, you have hardly anything.
Well, I think by the time 200 years have passed, we're getting to pretty much complete books, aren't we? But you're quite right. The first manuscript portion we have, which, like you say, is only about the size of a credit card. It's the John's Gospel passage, chapter 8,
P52, which is only
exactly,
it's in John Riley's Manchester.
Because the New Testament was first of all written on papyrus, which was cheap material because the first Christians were poor people. Okay, they wrote it on papyrus. Papyrus decays quite easily. It's amazing, really, that we have as many.
But if they can preserve
of the New Testament on papyrus,
if they can preserve the Dead Sea Scrolls for so many years, which is prior.
But it wasn't written on papyrus, though, was it? It was written on.
Well, regardless,
skin.
The point here is that
it's like the Quran was written on animal skin.
No, it was written on many other things as well.
Yeah, okay.
But the point here is that if God wanted to preserve your book, He would have, right?
Yes, and we believe He has preserved it.
No, but this is what you believe.
Yeah, that's right.
The facts shows otherwise. So when you talk about preservation, you should be able to convincingly show us from the first early centuries whether this is exactly what Jesus preached. Because what we have, what you were just reading there with all the red letters, this is a claim that this is the words of Jesus. But there's no way to substantiate that without a manuscript evidence or even an oral tradition like the Muslims have. We have two modes of preservation. We have the manuscripts from the first century Hijrah, plus we have the oral tradition. Exactly. So we have two very strong modes of preservation.
But the manuscripts do not match the oral tradition.
Have you done the studies?
Problem, haven't you?
Have you actually researched this? Because this is a claim many Christians make, but they haven't looked into the actual research.
I agree. Many Christians, because the Muslim scholars did not tell us until Christians researched it that in fact there were Quranic manuscripts.
Christians researched it. Well, what do you mean the Christians researched it?
I'm talking about Christians.
Who do you think preserved these manuscripts? The Christians?
No.
Then who? The Muslims, of course.
Yeah, of course the Muslims had to keep the manuscripts, which is why it's surprising there are so few manuscripts from the old times. Why there's so few?
It's better to have few than zero.
Okay.
It's better to have few than zero.
It is better to have few than zero, but the few that we don't have apparently do not match the Quran which we have today.
That's your claim. Can you show me one example where it doesn't match?
Well, Well, there have been scholars. I'm not a scholar, obviously, in ancient.
Name me a scholar who has actually researched this
people,
and says it's different.
Most recently, these people like Dan Brubaker, Dr. Daniel Brubaker, brought his book out recently.
Yeah.
You know, before that,
Have you actually looked into those people's?
Point and so on like that. Okay.
So Brubaker and Keysmore, have you actually looked at the research?
I have read some of their stuff. Yes.
Yes.
I am not.
You know how
an Islamic scholar.
You know how easily they.
I'm not a scholar in this.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, neither am I.
Okay, yes.
So what I'm saying is this. Unless you actually look at it from both sides of the argument as to what Brubaker is actually saying and whether it is up to it stands up to scrutiny, which it doesn't actually. So there are people who actually have released videos against Brubaker's research. It just shows some of it is so flimsy. Yes.
Really?
So certain manuscripts.
Can you point me to a scholar who shows that what Brubaker says is untrue?
Yeah, I can.
When Brubaker shows the corrections that have been made in the Quran. And the difference between the Quranic manuscripts and today's accepted Quran, the Quran which is usually recited today.
Yeah. So for example, one most important thing is that they look at certain vowels. For example, the vowels can be written in different ways. So the alif can be written in different ways. So Brubaker says just because it's written differently in both places, the important point is he doesn't realize that it's pronounced the same.
Okay.
For us, the Quran is a recitation. The very term Quran means to recite too.
Yeah,
hear me out. I'm telling you why Brubaker's research doesn't stand up to scrutiny. So
he shows where things have been inserted or deleted and that kind of thing.
Yeah, he looks at. So he looks
not just an alif or something like that, like you say. You might say, oh well, there's just one vowel or whatever, like that.
No, but because you haven't looked.
Whole words been
added
or erased.
The whole words which have been added and removed. What he doesn't realize is that the Quran is actually revealed in 7 different recitations, not just one recital. Yes. So he needs to take that into consideration before he actually makes a statement that this is.
But didn't Osman standardize the Quran on just one recitation?
No, that's a different thing. We're talking about there's a difference between the qira'at, which is still.
He said you got to write it in the Qurayshi dialect. Okay?
Yeah.
So there's one way.
Yeah. So the seven books of recitation is not that Quraysh dialect thing. It's different. Okay. That's why I'm saying you need to understand the nuances about researching about this topic. Without that, you won't be able to. And this is exactly the mistake that DCCI make. Because what they do is they listen to certain statements from other scholars, and they do not even realize what these scholars were talking about. So when you talk about the 7 modes of recitation, this is the different ways in which it can be recited. So it can be different words being substituted for other words. It can be, for example, a word which might be used in a different way. The same word might be used in a different way.
There's still 7 different ways
of
reciting the Quran.
Yes, still to this day.
Okay.
There you go. So all these hafs, warsh, qalun, all these different ways of reciting, the modes of recitation, is still active to this day.
They're called qiraat, okay. I'm right, it's saying they're called qiraat, okay. Are you saying that those qiraats are exactly the same as the aruf, I think it's called, isn't it, right? Which is what the ways in which, when Muhammad said you can recite the Quran in 7 different aruf, is that the correct Arabic term, yeah?
Yes.
So you're saying that qiraat is the same as aruf?
No, I'm not saying it's the same. Okay. I'm saying the qiraat, then inside the qiraat there's these different ahruf, which shows the reasoning for these differences within that. So they're 2 different things, not the same thing. But the important point is this: all these 7 qiraat was already revealed to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. You see, in his time, it wasn't something that was invented later on. Like for example, if you look at the Catholic book and the Protestant book, you don't even agree about the number of books in there. Yes? So the Protestants say we have 66 only. The Catholics say no, we have 73 books.
Yeah,
so
the Catholics accept all the 66 plus some.
All the 73, yes. That's what I'm saying. They do not even agree upon the number of books, let alone whether there are mistakes in it. So if you look at scholars like Bart Ehrman, who are actually scholars of the New Testament and who research the history of the preservation of these books, they say this person, some layperson who is just saying.
No, he's a scholar.
Exactly. He's just not pulling out his statements from thin air. So when he makes statements like there are as many differences between the different manuscripts, so the Christians claim that there are 5,000 manuscripts, that is besides the point. If you do not have the autographs, the originals from, or even from the manuscript from the 1st century, there's no way for anyone to identify what Jesus said from what was found in the 4th century.
Well, this is the whole scholarly study of textual criticism.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. Yes.
By comparing the manuscripts and
Yes.
seeing there are some small variations.
No, not small. That's what I'm telling
small
you.
variations between the manuscripts.
My friend.
But by comparing them all, we can deduce what is the original version. Okay.
This is the claim of the Christians, that there are only minor differences.
Yeah.
But if you look at the actual scholars like Bart Ehrman, what they say is that there are so many. Hear me out. Hear me out. No. This is. I'll tell you what.
Well,
I'll tell you exactly what Bart said about the number of differences in the. Just sorry. The the variances that's found in the manuscripts. I'll tell you exactly what Bart Ehrman said. In fact, he says something like there are so many variances. There are as many variances as there are number of words in the New Testament.
yeah, because there are thousands of
Exactly.
variants between the thousands of manuscripts.
So they don't agree with each other. That's the point he was making.
There are, if you have right, okay, there are thousands of variants between the thousands of manuscripts. Okay.
Okay.
But I think you'll find that Bart Ehrman is pretty happy about the text of the New Testament.
Even the differentiation between what I mean, the core of the belief is changed.
Yeah, give me the reference.
Okay.
I'll quote from Bart Ehrman in Misquoting Jesus.
Okay, I'm going to quote from Misquoting Jesus as well.
Okay, good. He was actually a Christian.
He said about
Yeah.
the book to him because he was both my inspiration for going into textual criticism and the person who trained me in this field. I have nothing but respect and admiration for him. And even though we may disagree on important religious questions, he is a firmly committed Christian and I am not. We are in complete agreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions. If he and I were put into a room, I'm losing it. Sorry. If he and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement, maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. Okay?
So this is not from.
From this is page 252.
Okay. The last paragraph, the position.
For him, misquoting Jesus.
Of discussing the actual doctrines of Christianity. So the doctrines remain the same.
That's right.
Okay?
Yeah. He would say there's
But
nothing in
the
Christian
point that we were
doctrine.
discussing, was the actual text itself. Now let's see what Bruce Metzger says. Wait.
He says that with the last paragraph before that. He says that
go on.
there would only be 1 or 2 dozen places in the whole of the New Testament, where he and Bruce Metzger would disagree upon what the text of the New Testament is.
No, he says about the teachings.
No,
So read that again, the last paragraph.
That's the last paragraph. The paragraph before that says, if he and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be variants in the manuscripts. He and Professor Metzger would have only maybe 1 or 2,000 places where they would be in disagreement about what the original text
Probably.
is.
The important point there is probably.
Of course.
So this is because he doesn't have the original.
Of course, he doesn't have the original
Paragraphs.
manuscripts, and therefore he cannot say this is 100% certain. What
So now we are going on
That's why
probability.
he uses the word probably.
Yeah, let's see what Bruce Metzger, his teacher, actually says about this. So Bruce Metzger says, sorry, Here it is. So this is Bruce Metzger from the New Testament, a historical introduction to the early Christian writings.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry, that is Bart Ehrman actually. Let me
Bart
bring
Ehrman,
up Bruce Metzger. Oh, here it is. So this is, from the same book. The text of the New Testament is transmission, corruption, and restoration.
Yeah.
This is from Bruce Metzger.
Yeah.
Okay, it says none of the original documents of the New Testament is extant, and existing copies differ from one another. The textual critic seeks to ascertain from the divergent copies which form of the text should be regarded as most confirming to the original. So you already agree that none of the originals exist.
That's
yes?
right, yeah.
And then there are,
would agree with him on that. You know, we don't have the original manuscripts as they're written by the original author.
and the existing copies differ from one another. Now, the important point is that Bart Ehrman, in misquoting Jesus, this is what he says. It is one thing to say that the originals were inspired, but the reality is that we don't have the originals. So saying that they were inspired doesn't help me much unless I can reconstruct the originals. This is Bart Ehrman. And then he goes on to say, moreover, the vast majority of Christians of the entire history of the church have not had access to the originals, making their inspiration something of a moot point. Okay, so you can say I'm inspired regardless of that. They don't have the original. So your inspiration is just your claim. No. And then he goes on to say, wait, I haven't finished it. He goes on to say, not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have the copies of the originals.
I think that's a bit of a claim myself. But
all copies of the copies of the originals. Let me finish and then you can say.
Yeah.
Okay?
Because
what we have, I'll let you finish.
Is only
I'll let you finish. You let me finish it and then we can talk about, because it's important you listen to what Bart Ehrman is actually saying.
Carry on.
Okay, so what he's saying is that not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals, we don't even have the copies of the originals, or the copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. Yes? What we have are copies made later, much later. In most instances, they are copies made many centuries later. And these copies all differ from one another in many thousands of places, centuries later.
Of variations, variations.
The important point there is centuries later. You know, in one video, I actually heard Bart Ehrman say,
which are centuries after. Yes, true.
You know how many centuries after?
There are some which are centuries
Most
after.
of your manuscripts are how many centuries after? Do you know?
Most of them would be, as you say, centuries after.
Just give a guess. Go on.
Because,
take a guess.
Typically, we would say there are 5,800 whatever Greek manuscripts. 5,800.
How many years after?
56, I think is the latest figure or whatever. Yeah. So
that's a
most
point.
of those would not be within the first 2 centuries.
So when is your?
They will be from 300,
where is your
500, 600, 700, 800, 900, 1000 AD, etc. Yeah.
The bulk of the manuscripts is from which century? Do you know? Or after which century?
I would say probably from after 500 AD. Will probably majority of them will definitely be from after 500 AD, I would say. Yeah?
Actually, more further than that.
Okay, I'll give it to you.
I heard Bart Ehrman actually state this.
Yes.
He said majority, he said 94% or something like that, of the manuscripts of the New Testament are from the 9th century onwards.
Okay.
9th century. You know how many years? That is nearly a millennia after Jesus.
No, 800 onwards. Okay. Yes? 700 years after Jesus.
Nearly a millennia after Jesus.
Okay.
Now you tell me, by the way, let me finish the last paragraph he says. He says these copies differ from one another in so many places.
Same with the Quran. There are more manuscripts the later you go. Okay.
So we have everything.
That is normal.
Remember, we have 2 modes of preservation. So our most important or the primary mode of preservation has always been the oral tradition. And we have the names. We have the names of the people.
Yeah.
The chain of.
That is the problem, isn't it?
No, it's not. We have the chain of transmission. We have the chain of transmission, which means
you do not know that what you're reciting now is the same.
Of course we do. Of course we do.
In the first centuries.
In fact, we don't only know.
But you have no proof of it.
My friend, I said we have the first century manuscripts. We have the first century Al-Hijra manuscripts.
Manuscripts can prove what you're reciting.
We have the first century Al-Hijra manuscripts. You're not listening.
Yeah.
We have the first century Al-Hijra manuscripts, which you don't have from the first century. We have from the first century of our prophet. You don't have first century from Jesus.
The first century manuscripts you're referring to, probably Sana, yeah? Okay.
No, not only Sana. We have the top copy, the Sana. We have the Birmingham manuscripts.
First century, is it?
Sorry?
Top copy is not from the first century of Islam.
First century Al-Hijra. It is from the first century Hijrah. Yes.
Top copy is
It is from
the
within.
first century
It is.
of Islam.
Of course, it is.
No, it's not.
Top copy